Hello and welcome. My name's Nick Williams. I'm part of the project team building the new homes for Marks Gate alongside the A12 at what's known as Padnell Lake. I'm really excited to be joined today by Peter Vellet, who's the senior archaeology consultant for ADAS, who's undertaking some of the archaeological surveys on the site on our behalf. He's come along today to tell us a little bit about what they're looking for, and also he's going to answer some of the questions that members of the public have posed about what's going on there. So welcome, Peter. How are you?
I'm good, Nick. Thank you very much for agreeing to do this.
So let's go straight into it, because the question that about 4 or 5 people have asked is very simple. Why are you carrying out the excavations at Marks Gate, and what have you found?
What we're doing is something called a trial trench evaluation, and it's used to gain a better understanding of the archaeological potential at a proposed development. So a lot of the time, archaeologists will come in before building work starts to try and understand what impact there will be to the archaeology that's there.
Okay, and what have you found?
So we found one archaeological feature, which was a ditch. We believe it to be an agricultural boundary ditch that's not all that old. And we also found a single piece of pottery in one of the trenches. And I'm afraid that's it.
Okay. Well, it sounds like I mistakenly described it as Saxon pottery, but I understand you've had some experts take a quick look at it and they've come to a different conclusion.
They have indeed. So you weren't necessarily mistaken, because I had told you Saxon as well. Something that we as archaeologists do is a process called spot dating, where if we find a piece of pottery, we use what experience we have to offer up a suggestion or an estimate as to how old it is. And originally it was thought that it was Saxon or early medieval. It turns out the pottery is actually from between the mid 11th century to the 12th century, so it's medieval in date.
Okay. Who was on the throne then? What sort of kings and queens might we associate with that sort of period?
So a particularly famous name would be William the Conqueror, who defeated Harold at the Battle of Hastings and became King of England. And that started the Norman period and the medieval period in this country.
Does that mean that there was some kind of Norman settlement in this area?
Certainly not on the site. We only have the one piece of pottery, and there are no other artifacts or features like pits and ditches that would indicate to us that we have a settlement on the site. However, sort of looking in the wider landscape, Romford is first mentioned in documents in the 11th century. So, that ties in nicely. We have a medieval settlement there. And I believe what we're looking at on this site, certainly during that period, is the medieval agricultural landscape around that settlement at Romford.
Okay. But my understanding is this week you're doing some other trenches, and that's for a slightly different purpose. Can you explain what that's for?
Yes. So during the first set of trenches that we dug in December of last year, we found a number of different deposits of soil on the site. So the highest deposit was made ground. So that's been deposited, and we believe that might be associated with the excavation and the construction of Padnell Lake. And the material that was removed from where the lake is now was deposited across the rest of the site. Underneath that, we had a deposit of something called alluvium, which is a floodwater-borne deposit of material. And then underneath that, we have something called the Boyne Hill gravel member, which is a natural geology. It's mostly made up of gravels, but of other materials as well. And that dates to roughly 450 to 350,000 years ago. So it's a very old deposit. What we're doing during these trenches is a set of more scientific methods that we can use. One of them is something called OSL dating. And that allows us to take a small sample of soil and understand when it was last exposed to light. And it's a dating method we can use when we don't have more traditional dating methods like artifacts. So we're using that as one method, and we're also looking at some of the environmental remains in that alluvium. So we're looking at things like pollen, fossilized plant remains, the presence for any kind of algae that might have been in that alluvium, and potentially for things like snails. And all of that information allows us to better understand the environment at the time that material was forming. And it all comes down to us better understanding not only the environment at Padnell Lake when that material was forming, but it also gives us the opportunity to feed that piece of the puzzle into a much wider data set looking at London and sort of countrywide as well, to better understand how the environment changed over time.
So what you're suggesting is underwater, some of that area?
The landscape and the environment has changed dramatically. And in fact, those gravels that I was talking about, believe it or not, belong to the Thames River. Oh. Which might come as a bit of a surprise, given how far away the Thames is from Padnell Lake. But rivers change over time. They evolve in a way and move throughout the landscape. So that the River Thames has moved and changed dramatically over a very long period of time.
And one of our questioners, Alex Lynch, who's one of the heritage volunteers, asked about the use of the area for farmland. Can you actually tell, what kind of crops were planted there, or how the land usage has changed over time?
I'm afraid not. I think possibly, from what we can tell, the land surface that existed at that time, when it was agricultural land during the post-medieval period, that seems to have been quite badly damaged when the groundworks were taking place to build Padnell Lake itself.
We had another question from Kay Morehouse, who asked a really good question from my point of view. How on earth do you find anything? Like that bit of pottery you mentioned, for example. They're quite large, these trenches. Honestly, how do you find it?
They are indeed. Sometimes it boils down to luck, in all honesty. And it takes a keen eye, and you develop that over a long period of time. And I find myself, staring at the ground when I walk down the street, because it just gets sort of burned into your way of thinking as an archaeologist. Yeah. So yes.
Karen Rushton, who's actually the borough archivist, asked me to ask you, what's going to happen to this piece of pottery and the information you find? Where does this all go?
So the pottery will be looked at further by specialists and reported on, and that will form part of the overall report written for the site. And then everything will go in together as part of the archive of the site, and all archaeological sites get archived. It's part of our process, and that will be put in with one of the museums in London, who are responsible for looking after archives. In terms of the piece of pottery itself, it's I'm afraid not the most interesting pieces of pottery, and it is on its own, it's the only artifact we've found so far. So it could potentially be put into a more local museum on display.
Okay, well, I'm sure we'll hear more from Karen about that in particular. Listen, thanks, Peter, so much for your time. Thanks for taking a moment to get out of the mud that is currently on that site. When do you actually finish your work?
So we're hoping to finish these last set of trenches early next week.
Okay. And from our point of view, our intention is to, as soon as we get a dry spell, we'll try and make sure that that's reinstated for local residents' use as soon as is physically possible. So, okay, thanks ever so much, Peter. And I know that you've offered to ask any other questions that are sent in. So the moment we finish this broadcast, I'll just put up our website and you can send your questions in there for Peter, and he's agreed to answer them. So that's it for now. Thanks everybody for joining us, and thanks to those of you that sent in your questions. Thanks very much.
All right, thank you.